evening, everyone. Thanks for coming along to this Census Data Seminar. My name's Duncan Young. I'm the Census Program Manager, so I've been head of a Census program over the last 5 years, and I'll be tag teaming tonight with one of my colleagues, Philip Wise, here in front of me, who's the Director of Census Data Dissemination. So you don't get too bored of my voice during the presentation, we'll be sort of switching over a little bit as we go through. Just so you're aware, this seminar is being broadcast, so the cameras at the back there, we're broadcasting live on the web, so people will be tuning in from all over the place. So hello everyone who's tuned in. So if you ask any questions, but they will obviously come across on the webcast as well. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're presenting on today are the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. And welcome anyone from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who are here with us today or are tuned in on the webcast. Part of the way that the Australian Bureau of Statistics pays our respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to try and make sure that they're fully represented in all of the statistics that we collect and disseminate. And so in this census, we counted some 6,468 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here in the Canberra region, which is a 26% increase on 5 years ago. And so a growing being part of our small community here in Canberra. So our presentation today is on the census, but why do we care about the census? And yet we care a fair bit about the census of the ABS. It's because it is our most detailed, comprehensive data set in Australia on our people and on the households in which they live, and it's used for a whole range of different purposes. So it's used for producing our population estimates, which help us set electoral boundaries, or help the Electoral Commission set electoral boundaries, set the number of seats in Parliament, but also is used for distributing government funding around the country. It's used extensively in government planning, administration and policy development, as well as used in every other ABS statistic. So we publish some 500 statistical releases every year of the ABS, and whether it's business statistics or population statistics, the benchmarks that the census provides population are critical to those. But it's one of the fun things about the census is it's our most used data set by the community. It's the data set that everyone can see themselves in and can relate to. And so we've seen some of our products online, our quick stats, our community profiles, but we're approaching 1 million views now since release. We saw Table Builder, which we'll mention later on. We saw 1.6 billion cells of information downloaded on its first day. So it's a very widely used data set. But we'll give you a little bit of a taste of it, the census data set today from a national level, but also focusing a little bit on Canberra and our community here. So what have we been doing in the last 11 months since everyone completed their census forms? Well, we've been pretty busy at the ABS. We had some 8.5 million household forms and some 750,000 personal forms from a census. And so we had to turn all of that information into the statistics that we've now released. Some 3.5 million forms were on paper, and so that paper obviously has to be scanned in and all of the data recognised. And unfortunately, doctors aren't the only people in Australia with messy handwriting, so it takes some time to try and turn people's descriptions into the statistics. But through 700 coding and processing staff, through some 5.3 billion data transactions, through some 23 million clerical operations, we've produced 68.9 million beautiful pieces of data that we released a few weeks ago. These are presented in 2.8 million tables, and if we were going to step through those tonight, we'd actually be here much longer than tonight. It would take us 2 years to step through every piece of data in the census if we gave each fact 1 second each. So I can assure you we'll just keep it to highlights tonight, but hopefully give you a little bit of a taste of the diversity of census data and some of the key stories that census data tells. Conducting a census allows us to produce the highest quality sort of data set that we have by visiting every home in Australia and following up with those homes to make sure that the data that we collect is representative of the full population. And so what we saw in this census, pleasingly, was continuing high levels of support from the Australian public, so a 95.1% response rate. If anyone's conducted a survey, a 95% response rate you'd be pretty rapt with. It's a fantastic data set. One of the things that we're really pleased from a quality perspective with was the significant increase in the number of people participating online. So we saw 80% more responses online than we saw last census, and 63.3% of people participated online. Now, this is a little bit lower than our 65% target. We probably know some of the reasons for that, but that significant increase is from last time means that we've got a higher quality data set. Because what we see when people fill it out online is they leave less questions blank and they can follow through the questions a little bit easier. We also saw that it was 12 minutes faster than last census to participate online. And here in Canberra, we saw that 81.0% of the population participated online, which is a pretty amazing effort, but not as good as some of our migrant communities. So Indian-born on usual residents of Australia, 85.4% participated online, and our Chinese-born population of Australia, 90% of them participated online. So they've really sort of set the bar for us as we move forward. The other quality measure of a census is how well does it represent the population of Australia? So what's the coverage of a census? And to measure this, we actually run another survey after a census. We love a survey at the ABS, so any excuse, we got out to 50,000 households and interviewed every household about each member of that household and where they might have been on census night. And we actually capture up to 10 different addresses from each household of where they might have been on census night. We link that up to the census in order to get a measure of how many people did we count twice, how many people did we miss in the census, in order to come up with a coverage figure. And what we found this census, the net undercount was 1.0%. So if we'd counted everyone on census night, we would have had 1% more people in the census count, which is a really close alignment, actually a closer alignment at a national level than we've ever seen before. So stepping into Australia is what we'll do next, but also we'll talk about Canberra. So you know what Canberra is. It's both a territory, but what we're going to focus on here is a greater capital city area of Canberra. So the population of Australia counted in a census was some 23,401,892 people in Australia on census night. Now, we also counted over 300,000 overseas visitors in Australia on census night, but we take them out of our usual residence count. What we don't count on census night are the number of people overseas on census night. So it was actually over 600,000 Australians overseas on census night. But probably having a better night than I had, but we get their information from the passport control at the airport so that we can add them back into our usual into our estimated resident population. And what we could see from a census was Australia was up to 24.4 million people by the end of 2016, by December 31st. Now, our population's grown by some 8.8% over the last 5 years. That's a little bit faster than our population has grown over a history of the country, but not significantly faster. And our population's doubled since 1966, which was a double from 1921. So we are in a time of growth. Where does our population live in Australia? Well, some 80% of our population are now in either Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria or the ACT. So that's 80% of our population and only 20% spread across the other states and territories. New South Wales is our largest state, still, with some 7.5 million people. And in Victoria, some nearly 6 million people counted in this census. ACT just missed out on 400,000 people in the census count this time, but will certainly sort of burst through that marker next census. Looking at growth rates and change over time, you can see that the growth rate from state to state varies considerably. So Tasmania in South Australia must be Australia's best kept secrets. Tasmania only grew by 3% over the last 5 years, South Australia by 5%. Then you've got Queensland, Northern Territory and New South Wales, which are all growing by around the national average, just a bit under. But what's really dragging the national growth rate up has been the growth of Western Australia, the growth of Victoria and the growth of ACT, with the biggest growth in census counts over the last 5 years. Looking at our capital cities rather than the whole of states, you get a slightly different picture. So in this picture here, and capital cities, what we saw is actually capital cities are home to more and more of our population in Australia. So now 2 out of every 3 people in Australia lives in one of our capital cities. And one of the big drivers of this has been our migrant community. So if we look at all of the international migration over the last 25 years, some 86% of the migrants which have come to Australia in the last 25 years are now living in a capital city. So we saw our capital cities growing at nearly twice the rate of the rest of states. So 10.5% in the capital city, 5.7% in the rest of states. What this picture is showing you here is the differential growth rate between capital cities. So Darwin's actually been our fastest growing capital city over the last 5 years. But what gets all the attention is the Melbourne versus Sydney capital city growth. So Sydney is still our biggest capital city, but Melbourne has and is growing faster. So this picture here shows the relative populations of Sydney and Melbourne since 1991. And you can see that actually Sydney got a little bit further ahead through 2000 and the Sydney Olympics kind of era. Sydney was growing very strongly, but then over the last 10 years, Melbourne has been gaining considerably. And so Melbourne welcomes some 1,859 new people every single week into the city over the last 5 years. So probably explains why it took me so long to get to the airport yesterday. Looking at the ACT, we've got differential population growth as well across areas here. So we've got areas like Tuggeranong, which has actually declined in population over the last 5 years. You've got Western Creek, which has only had a very marginal growth in population. Whereas, as the newspapers called it, Gungahlon's grown by some 50% over the last 5 years and is now bigger than a lot of country towns with over 70,000 people. I think it's the first time I've ever seen a chart which says that an area has grown by 14,309.5%. And I'll give you a tip now, Molongo won't grow by that much next census. So, but obviously, so new areas emerge with big population growth. If you dig into those pictures, Tuggeranong's a much older population than some of the other areas of the ACT. So talking about older populations, Australia as a whole is getting much older. So if we wind back to 1991 and here is a picture of Australia. This is a population age pyramid. So on the right-hand side there, you've got males, and on the left-hand side, you've got females. And each line, and up the middle, you've got ages in 5-year age groups. And we like a good population pyramid of ABS. And each of these lines represent a proportion of a population at each different age. And so what you can see here is it's like a solid rectangle at the bottom, all the way up to 40 to 44 years of age. So they're the most popular or most common age groups in the population, and they're reasonably consistent. And then you can see from there it decreases. So you're less likely to be 45 to 49 than you are to be 40 to 44. You're less likely to be 50 to 54. So reducing it as you get into the older age groups. So let's put on top of this the picture of Australia in 2016. And so Australia here in 2016 is in the blue, and this is it's got a case of middle-age spread going on here. So you can see that the orange lines at the bottom here are much smaller. There's a bit of a bite taken out of there. So we have less children proportionately within our population, and we've got more people now sort of in the older kind of age groups. So we've moved in Australia from having, right back in our first census, it was only 1 in every 25 Australians was over the age of 65 in 1911. Last census was 1 in 7 of Australians are over the age of 65. This census, it's 1 in 6 of every Australian is over the age of 65. In Tasmania, it's 1 in every 5 of the population are over the age of 65. So sort of significant change there. There's an even bigger change happening in the 85 pluses in the chart. And so our charts keep getting extended. We used to group them all together, 65 plus, then 75 plus, and now these ones are all way up to 95 plus. And so there's some 486,842 Australians over the age of 85. So that's basically Tasmania. It's not Tasmania, they're different people, but it's the size of Tasmania. And you can see there's much more on the right than the left there. So about 2 in every 3 Australians over the age of 85 are female, so reflecting the fact that females are out surviving males in Australia. My kids are here tonight. I first decided to come along and see a data seminar. And so kids, 10 to 11-year-olds, it's in that graph there, so your age, there's 572,082 10 or 11-year-olds in Australia. So when I say that you're 1 in a million, I'm exaggerating. You're actually 1 in 572,000, but you're very special all the same. Stepping on to the ageing population in the ACT, or the age profile of the ACT. So this is Australia in the orange and the ACT in the blue. And what you can see here is a bit of a different picture. It's actually a slightly younger population in the ACT, with a significant extra number of people between 20 and 39 in the ACT. So reflecting people coming here to study, people coming here to work, but maybe also reflecting people leaving ACT as they get into retirement or into older years. So a bit of a different shape here within the territory. Across Australia, we counted 649,171 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in this census. That's an increase of 18.3% from 5 years ago, which is an increase of 20% from 5 years before that. So it's a fast-growing population count, and it's actually grown since in 1971 it was 120,000. So in the time period that Australia's doubled in size, the number of people in Australia identifying with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin has increased 500%. But most of the growth we've seen over the last 5 years has actually occurred in the eastern states of Australia. So the population in New South Wales of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders has increased by 25%, ACT 26%, Queensland 20%, whereas the Northern Territory's only increased by 3% over that time period. Told you I loved an age pyramid, an age-sex pyramid, and this is the age-sex pyramid representing the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population versus the non-Indigenous population of Australia. So as you can see, the non-Indigenous population's got the middle-age spread that you saw before here, but what you can see is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population is a significantly younger age profile. So half the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population are under the age of 25 compared to only a third of the total Australian population. And so this is reflecting in some levels of higher fertility and higher birth rate, but it's also reflecting lower life expectancy towards the upper end of the pyramid. The median age of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders has increased from 21 years to 23 years over the last 5 years. However, that's still significantly lower than 38 across the whole population. Consistent with the growth rates I was talking about, the majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders live in our eastern states, with over 60% of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders living in New South Wales or Queensland. But if you look at the right-hand column there, you look at the proportion of the population, you can see that over a quarter of the population of the Northern Territory identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin, significantly more than any other state, with Tasmania actually the second highest proportion of the population with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin, with 4.6%. This is a bit of a thematic map of where the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population are within the ACT. You can see that the largest population and largest area for a population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders is Tuggeranong, followed by Belconnen. Largely this reflects the varying sizes of those different areas, but with Tuggeranong proportionately having slightly more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Okay, Phil's now going to give us a bit of an insight into our cultural and linguistic diversity.
Thanks, Duncan. So the real power in the census is not only population data, like Duncan's been talking us through, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. It's the diversity that the census captures right across Australia. And what I'm going to talk to you now in terms of culture and linguistic diversity is some of the really interesting stories that the 2016 census shows in this space. For me, you go on a holiday, so you get back from a holiday, what's the first thing your colleagues, your friends, your family ask you? What was the favourite thing that you did? For me, what my friends and family are asking at the moment is, what's your favourite statistic from the census? Out of 68.9 million pieces of data, it's pretty hard to choose. It's just like asking what's your favourite child. But for me, what jumped out was in the language spoken at home statistics. So 21% of respondents in the 2016 census said that they spoke a language other than English at home, which I found absolutely fascinating and really illustrative of not only people born overseas, like and we'll talk about country of birth shortly, but also people whose parents might have been born overseas and moved to Australia and they speak the language of their parents at home. So, yeah, I think all census data is fascinating, and what we've got here is some really fascinating stats. So, on this slide, we're looking at the generations of Australians. So, first generation are those who were born overseas. Second generation, at least one parent was born overseas. And then third generation, both the person and both of their parents were born overseas. So in my... Sorry? Born in Australia, sorry, yes. So in my case, I was born in Australia. Both of my parents were born in Australia. And one of my grandparents was born in New Zealand, so not the best poster child for cultural diversity. Unfortunately, the census doesn't capture regional Victorian variation in ancestry. But yeah, so for me, I'm definitely in that third plus generation Australian category. And what this slide really highlights is that, you know, essentially half of the Australian population were either born overseas or have at least one parent born overseas. So a really strong migration nation that we are. And compared to some of like similar nations to us, like New Zealand, UK, that figure, the first generation figure, is much higher in Australia. If we dig a little bit deeper into the data, I just love this stat. I have to say it every time I'm doing a data seminar, but of the second generation, so those with at least one parent born overseas, it's 35% more likely that the couple is an Australian-born mum and an overseas-born father. And I guess the other thing that this slide really highlights is that the ACT picture is very similar to the national picture in terms of the proportions of the generations of Australians. In Sydney, you can see much larger proportion of those born overseas, very close to 40%. So where do migrants live? What this slide is showing is the count of the overseas-born population for each state and territory, and then the proportion is that count as a proportion of the state or territory population. So what immediately jumps out is New South Wales has over 2 million people who were born overseas. Not surprisingly, our most populous state, also our largest overseas-born population. And Western Australia has the largest proportion of people born overseas, so almost 1 in 3 people in Western Australia were not born in Australia, which I think is you know, an incredible figure on balance when you think about it. Tasmania, only 12% born overseas. I like to think it's because it's harder to get to Tasmania, but other people might disagree. But in terms of some of the population growth figures that Duncan stepped us through earlier, what's really fascinating about the migrant population is that 83% of those born overseas live in capital city areas. So that's like one of those factors driving the population growth that we saw. In the Canberra region, we've got 26% of the Canberra population was born overseas. So very strong figure. Not quite as high as well, it's comparable to New South Wales and Victoria, which is where we see really significant cultural diversity in those populations. So recent arrivals, I love these stats. This is looking at people who have arrived in Australia since the 2006 census, and what we're seeing is that these 5 countries on this slide, so this is the national picture, make up almost half of recent arrivals to Australia. And what you can see there is really strong representation from India and China. So historically, what we'll tease out in future slides is that European migration, you know, especially England, Italy, Germany, was very prominent across Australia and made up the largest proportion of overseas arrivals to Australia. But in recent censuses, there's a real shift to the Asian-born population arriving in Australia and settling. So, you know, if you think back to around the year 2000, Australia had more than twice as many overseas-born people from Europe as Asia, but in the 2016 census, so just 15 years later, there's 20% more of us are born in Asia than Europe. So, not even one generation, a really significant shift in that population. In terms of the top 5 country of birth for recent arrivals in Canberra, what we saw was 18.3% from China, 16.1% from India, 6% from the UK, 4.9% from the Philippines, and 3.3% from the Republic of South Korea. So again, reflecting there that only the UK remains in that top 5 listing, so the real shift from European nations to Asian nations. What we'll see on the next slide is the last population pyramid for this evening. So this really teases out some of those generational shifts that I was talking about in terms of, you can clearly see European-born people counted in the census are significantly older than Asian-born people counted in the census. The median age for those born in Europe was 59 years, and for those born in Asia, 35. So really interesting and significant shifts going on in where recent arrivals to Australia are coming from and in the age profile of those people. So in this slide, we're digging a little bit deeper into the countries of birth in the ACT. So here what we're looking at, obviously excluding Australia, but the top 10 countries of birth in the 2016 census were, so England remains the top, but you can see in the difference between the blue and the orange bars, the really strong growth from the Chinese and Indian-born populations moving to Canberra, and also a significant jump in the Philippines-born population. But the top 10 is also rounded out with the United States, for example, and New Zealand, and then the rest are all Asian nations, really highlighting that trend that we've been developing through the recent slides. Now this is a great picture. So this is our colleagues in our geography area actually helped us pull this together. So if we exclude the Australian-born population and the UK, and England and New Zealand, what this map is showing is where the top countries of birth in the ACT, where those people live. In the top, like north of the lake, you can see a very strong Chinese influence. So that all that band of red above the lake is Chinese-born population. South of the lake, all the green are the Indian-born population settling in Canberra. So what's driving that? I don't really know. But we put this map together not knowing what it would look like, and we're just blown away by that, the divide. We always talk about the north-south lake divide, and clearly there's something going on south of the lake for the Indian-born population and something going on north of the lake for the Chinese-born population. But some of the other notable features, I think, are, it might be a bit hard to pick up, but we did talk about the Philippines as featuring in the top 10 and also top 5 in terms of growth in recent arrivals. So they're represented in this sort of peachy colour that comes through the south, I always get my directions mixed up, southeast of the ACT. The blue in the southeast is the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and the blue in the southwest is Italy. The yellow is Papua New Guinea, but that's only about 6 people. That's the statistical region where the airport is, so it's a very low base that is just being highlighted there. But the other notable thing, I think, is that when you look in the region around the ACT, it's all pink, it's all the United States of America. Diplomats with hobby farms, I don't know. Pure speculation. Ancestry. So I find Ancestry really fascinating. So I kind of stepped you through my own family background. The way that I think about, well, the way the ABS defines Ancestry is it's the cultural group that a person most closely identifies with. Through my own lens, you think about, well, would I respond Australian or English or Scottish? Would my parents respond Australian or English? Would my grandparents, the one who was born in New Zealand, would he respond Kiwi or New Zealander? Or would he respond English Or would he respond Australian because he moved to Australia when he was only 4 years old? You know, all these factors come into play, and we do collect multiple responses on the Ancestry question, so I think there's a real, you can really get some insight into not just like the country of birth statistics, but some of those cultural groups through the generations that flow through. When I think about this question in detail, like I was fortunate enough to do the Wollongong data seminar last week, and I grew up in Wollongong, so there's a really strong migrant population in Wollongong, but that European migration influence is now filtering through to the children. So I played junior soccer for 10 years. Most of my teammates were sons of Lebanese-born migrants. We were coached by the sons of Italian-born migrants, and then half of our schedule was against teams where it was the sons of Greek migrants, the sons of Macedonian migrants, the sons of, you know, all these different ethnicities in what's really a relatively, well, it's a major regional town, but, you know, in the scheme of things, no offence Wollongong, but not that significant a population. And Ancestry, I think, is where some of that comes into play. Like, at what point do those children identify with an Australian ancestry, and when do they associate with the ancestry of their parents? So in that context, what you see here is much stronger European influence in the Ancestry statistics. So you can see English was the top Ancestry response across Australia, as well as for the Canberra region. Australian was 33.5%, so a very close second. The other ancestries in the top 5, you can see Irish and Scottish. So Ireland and Scotland didn't feature at all in any of the recent arrival statistics that we talk through, all countries of birth, and yet they're quite significant ancestral populations that were reported in the 2016 census. The other thing is, like I mentioned, multiple responses. So we actually collected over 300 different Ancestry responses in the 2016 census, which I think is, you know, an amazing number. You know, especially growth. What we saw was the Chin ancestral response. So that's a Burmese ethnic minority, grew over 300% since the 2011 census. Punjabi increased 191%, and Hazara 150%. So really fascinating stuff. So language spoken at home, my favourite stat. So what I really wanted to tease out when talking through this slide was that I mentioned 21% speak a language other than English at home, but of that 21%, 82% of those people speak English well or very well. So it's not like we're saying that 21% of the population can't actually speak English. They actually can speak English very well, or well. And they choose to speak, you know, a different language at home. So that's why you see that difference in the 72.7% figure of people speaking English only. There's a difference there. It's not 100 minus 21% to get that figure. In the greater capital city of Canberra, so English was exactly the same as the national level. And we also had broadly similar proportions. You know, I think Mandarin slightly stronger in Canberra. We had a very strong growth in the Chinese-born population between censuses for Canberra. Yeah, no, I think it's just really interesting in terms of how all this plays out in the data. How many languages was it? I think it was, yeah, over 200. Yeah, so real diversity there. So religion. This obviously was of great interest to a lot of people in the media. Like a lot of so we saw some quite significant shifts at more of a 15 to 20 year period in the recent arrival statistics and then country of birth. But in religion, in a 5-year period, what we saw was a very significant jump in the proportion of people affiliating with, well, not affiliating with any religion at all. So the growth of no religion was a real talking point. What this slide is showing you is that you look back to 1966, 50 years ago, almost 90% of the Australian population had a Christian religious affiliation, and less than 1% had no religion at all. Fast forward to the 2016 census, and it's only just over half affiliating with a Christian religion, and almost 1 in 3 people saying that they have no religion. In Canberra, we're slightly more godless than the rest of our counterparts in Australia. So 36.8% said that they had no religion, but that's still significantly below the proportion that said that they were affiliated with a Christian religion. So still 45.4% is, it reflects that, like, I think when you look at religious affiliation as a whole, Australians are strong believers in, a Christian religion, or, some of the next top responses I think were Islam at 2.6% and Buddhism, I think Buddhism at 2.4%. So there's a real strong religious aspect to Australian society there, that the rise of no religion has been significant, but like the bigger picture is that we're still largely a religious nation. Over 60%, in fact, identified with some sort of religious affiliation. There's a lot of interesting stories that can be told with religious affiliation, and what this slide kind of shows is a breakdown with age. So what jumps out here is that you're looking at the 18 to 34-year-old population, young people. They're just as likely to say that they had a Christian religion as they are to say that they had no religion at all. When you look at the 65 years and over population at the bottom, just over 70% of people said that they had a Christian religious affiliation. So really stark difference in the age profile of people who are affiliated with different religions. There's a lot of really interesting talking points that we've dug out in relation to specific religions. So to give you a bit of a flavour, like the Catholic population is actually relatively young. So 44% of people who said that they were Catholic are aged 35 years or under, which surprised me. I would have, if I was to guess, I would have said that it was an older population. Men and women, so slight differences there. Women are more likely than men to report being Christian, 55% to 50%. Sikhs had the youngest age profile of any religion overall, so almost 3/4 of Sikhs were aged less than 35 years. So that's just only a very small taste of what you can learn about religious affiliation in the census.
Thanks, Phil. Phil's been talking about something which has changed quite dramatically in 5 years. What I'm going to talk about now is something which hasn't changed that quickly. So we counted 6.1 million families in Australia, and probably only one of them at a census data seminar tonight. But the 6.1 million families in Australia, 45% of the families are couple families of children, 38% were couples without children, and 16% were single-parent families, of which about 80% were female or single-parent families. Remembering that this is a census which is a snapshot on one night. So on a Tuesday night in August, it's 80% of the caring for children in single-parent families is being done by a female single-parent family, rather than it doesn't reflect how much custody or hours or anything over a full course of a week. So this hasn't changed much in 5 years, but you have to sort of wind back further to sort of see a big difference. If you wind back 25 years, there was about 9 percentage points more couples with children, so about 53% of all families were couples with children. And so where has that 9% gone? There's 6 percentage point more of couples without children, 3 percentage points more of single-parent families. So remembering that couples without children and could be couples that have never had children, they could also be older couples which have somehow managed to convince their children to leave home. So it can be the empty nesters or the never filled nesters. What we've seen in the census as well is about 2.6 people per dwelling, which hasn't changed over the last 5 years. One thing that has changed over the last 5 years has been the increase in the number of same-sex couples reported in the census. So it's increased by some 39% over the last 5 years, and it's increased by over 4.5 times since we started collecting information on same-sex couples back in 1996. You can see here that there's slightly more male same-sex couples than female same-sex couples, so 51% to 49%. But one of the significant differences between male same-sex couples and female same-sex couples is that 1 in 4 female same-sex couples had children or were living with children at the time of the census, but only 4.5% of male same-sex couples were a family with children at census time. This chart shows a couple of things, but the blue and orange represent 2011 and 2016 by state and territory. The height of the lines represents the proportion of all couples that are same-sex couples. So it's about 1% across the nation, 0.91% across the nation, and the ACT actually has the highest proportion of couples that are same-sex couples in Australia. If you look at counts, New South Wales has the highest count of same-sex couples, obviously with a much larger population than the ACT. Something else which has grown in the last 5 years are the number of people living alone in Australia. So 8.7% of a population, or 2.1 million Australians now live alone. And so what this chart shows is the proportion of a population at each age living alone for males and females. And so you can see not many children are left to live alone, which is sort of pleasing right at the bottom end. But then you go through the next stage there, or if they did, they didn't fill out their census form. If you go through the next period there, you can see that males are more likely at younger ages to be living alone. But then, and quite dramatically, you can see that orange line sort of shooting up, and females of older ages are much more likely to be living alone. And by the time you get to 85 to 89-year-olds, that cohort of females in Australia, 40% of them are now living alone. And if you overlay this with marital status, you can see two significant factors at play here. You can see divorces as leading to a number of females living alone and then being widowed. So basically the men are carking it and leaving the women to live alone into those later years. The census captures information on whether or not people need assistance in day-to-day life with feeding themselves, with movement, with the daily activities as part of life. And what we've seen across Australia is this has increased. The number of people reporting that they need assistance, daily assistance, has increased from 4.6% to 5.1% over the last 5 years. So it's now 1.2 million Australians. You can see here again, and sort of this dramatic increase as you get older. But actually here it increases faster for females than males. So the males which are surviving are actually needing care slightly later than females. So 50% of females by age 85 to 89 are requiring assistance, and 50% of males in the next 5-year age group are requiring assistance. But we've actually seen the older age, the proportion of the older age populations dropped slightly since 2011, suggesting that there is a bit of a living longer and healthier. But we've seen an increase in the number of young people reported as needing assistance, particularly males. You can see that little hump in blue there down in the younger age range. So who's caring for people who need assistance? Well, the census also captures a picture of people who provide unpaid care for someone with a disability or someone with a long-term illness or someone of old age. And what this picture shows here is this, I guess, real sort of peak period in sort of the Middle Ages here, from 45 to 49 through to 65 to 69, of people providing unpaid care to someone else. And so, and you can see that 55 to 59-year-old females, nearly 1 in 4, every female in Australia at that age within the last 2 weeks has provided unpaid care or assistance. So these are ages obviously where people are still working, still contributing in a range of different ways, but also providing a degree of unpaid care. 2.1 million Australians overall provided unpaid care in these categories, with about 2/3 of that population being female. You can also see that same story though around the surviving men in this picture. So once you get into those older age ranges, men proportionally are more likely to be providing care for someone else than females are in those age groups. you can overlay this picture again with people providing unpaid care for children other than their own. So this is a fantastic, this is a tribute to the grandparents slide, I believe. So you've got this big groups from 55 through to 75 or so of people providing unpaid care for someone else's children. And so in most cases, we think this is grandparents. And so again, you're sort of pushing up towards sort of, 1 in 4 or females in a couple of those age ranges providing unpaid care for children. And what you can also see here is that the grandfathers are doing their bit too. We've got 14% there of 65 to 69-year-old men providing unpaid care for children other than their own. And so we've got a little bit of a sandwich happening here, a little bit of a hero generation going on, I think, with this group providing care for parents but also care for the next generation. The next picture is a picture of volunteering. Who's volunteering in community organisations and groups? And isn't this great? You can see that we volunteer in Australia across all age ranges. There's a huge sort of block of volunteering here. We've got three mini peaks going on here. We've got the parents, so parents who get involved with volunteering community organisations or groups through their children and their children's schools. You've got the transition to retirement kind of group, which are doing a bit more volunteering, a bit more assisting out. But you've also got that awesome group down there at 15 to 19-year-olds who are also a bit more likely to be out there volunteering, which is a great sort of picture to see. This is the question which causes the most family arguments in the census, is deciding which box are you allowed to tick in terms of your unpaid work, unpaid domestic work in the week leading up to census. And I tried to argue with my wife that census week was an unrepresentative week for me, and usually, but she said, well, the question says census week, so I'm one of the very slack 21% of males there providing 0 hours of unpaid domestic work in the week leading up to census. You can see here clearly a picture of females still doing more unpaid domestic work than males, and so if you look at 15 hours or more per week, you've got some 1 in 4 women in Australia compared to only 8.2% and of men in Australia. This is representation of data is a little bit incomplete. So when we release these in October, the labour force kind of picture, it's going to be really valuable to bring all of this together. So you get the picture of unpaid care, the picture of volunteering, the picture of domestic work, and the picture of labour force status, and you can overlay all of those together to give a better, richer picture of our population across age and genders.
So in the census, religious affiliation is the only question that's optional. I think with unpaid domestic work, this is the only question that's actually mandatory. You have to consult with your partner before you respond. So income. The census collects a wealth of income information, so personal, household and family income, and it collects it in a very specific way. So this isn't just income from wages or salary, but this is income that you might have earned through some sort of investment or from government services, like you might be receiving a benefit, for example. When we look at the national picture for income, so median personal weekly income across Australia is $662. It's very similar for New South Wales and Victoria. As you can see, New South Wales is slightly higher, very similar to Australia average, but in the ACT, very large professional workforce, we have the highest median income of any state and territory in the nation, essentially $1,000. The difference between Canberra and the ACT figure is we're using the greater capital city of Canberra. The ACT includes Jervis Bay, so very slight difference there. WA and Northern Territory rounding out the top 3 for median personal income. So some influence from mining workforce there, I would speculate. But we'll be able to learn more in October when we release occupation data and industry of employment from the census, and that'll give us a much richer picture of what's happening underneath this headline figure. I think the other thing to highlight here is that the median personal income in capital city areas across the nation was $701 a week, but in regional areas it was $597. So that was a really interesting kind of dynamic that we've been teasing out when we've been visiting some of the regional areas. Like last week I was in Wollongong, Newcastle and Bathurst, and there was a lot of interest in that kind of regional disparity compared to capital city. Population growth is another good example. The capital cities are growing at roughly twice the rate of our regional areas, 10.5% to 5.7%. So unpacking that median income of essentially $1,000 a week in the ACT, what this slide is showing you is the proportion of the population for each of the income ranges that we release census income data on. And what you can see there is obviously the ACT had a higher median personal income. That's borne out in this graph. There's much higher proportions of the population in the larger income brackets on the right-hand side of the graph. But I think the power in census data is that it's not just one headline figure, it's actually, detailed small area data. What you see on the left is that median, that very high median, actually obscures a significant proportion of the population that are earning, in those lower income categories. I haven't actually put any thought into it, but that peak in the right-hand side, $2,000 to $3,000 a week, so you're in that roughly $100,000 to $150,000 a week. A year. That would be nice. But yeah, income distribution. There's some analysis to be done there, that's for sure. So moving on to mortgage repayments. The census told some really interesting stories in mortgage repayments. So what we're looking at here is per month for the capital city areas. And what jumps out is that the Canberra median mortgage repayments are $2,058 a month. That's significantly higher than the Australian median, which is $1,755. Interestingly, that Australia level median has decreased slightly since the 2011 census. So these are mortgage repayments, this isn't housing costs. Since the 2011 census, interest rates have decreased 2.5%. So I think it sort of like shows you the power and some of the limitations of census data in a sense. Like some people construe mortgage repayments, like certainly when we've been engaging with users with housing costs, but it's not the same concept, it's a different concept. But yeah, like what this graph really shows is Darwin, Perth and Sydney coming out on top, higher than the national median, and Canberra right up there as well. So what this slide is doing is overlaying kind of like a measure of mortgage stress in a sense. So all we've done here is the right-hand axis is showing the proportion of households. So it's not households with a mortgage, but it's all households that are paying more than 30% of their monthly income on mortgage repayments. So for Canberra, what we see is that 5.5% of households pay more than 30% of their income on mortgage repayments. That's significantly lower than the Australia figure, which was 7.2%, and it's certainly significantly lower than Perth, the highest, which was 9.3%. And I think that's a function of the higher incomes that we talked about before, being able to furnish, even though we had higher mortgage repayments than the national average on the previous slide, the incomes can still bring us beneath that threshold of 30% that we've applied. So rental costs. The interesting thing here is that I think even though the mortgage repayments kind of at a national level broadly stayed the same between censuses, rental costs have increased quite significantly in regional areas. So I mentioned Wollongong, Newcastle and Bathurst where I was last week. What we saw was 30+% growth in rental payments and significant growth in the rental stress that dwellings in those areas were experiencing. Like they all had significantly higher proportions of households paying more than 30% of their income on rental payments, which was fascinating. In Canberra, median rent is $380 a week compared to $335 for the rest of Australia. Median rent's highest in Sydney, Darwin and Perth, as well as Canberra. But when I overlay that same rental stress measure, I think what jumps out is that the scale of our axis on the right-hand side, we've really jumped in numbers. That stress, the proportion of dwellings that are paying more than 30% of their income on rent, those figures are all much higher than the equivalent mortgage figures. So in Canberra, 8.1% of households are paying more than 30% of their income on rent versus 11.5% across Australia. And I think interestingly, Sydney has the highest rents, what you can see from this graph, and it also has the highest rental stress. So it's becoming a real compounding factor where people are spending more of their income on rent, not being able to, save to buy a house. The cycle continues. So we've given you just a snapshot of some of those 68.9 million pieces of data. What I'll do now is talk you through how you can access census data to tell your own stories from the 2016 census, or use it to, perform some interesting research and analysis, really highlight some of the things that we haven't covered in this slide deck. We've certainly only given a bit of a regional picture and national comparisons. There's, a wealth of info waiting to be discovered within the 2.8 million tables of data. So on this slide, what we're really showcasing is the products that you can use to access the data. So what's new for 2016? The ABS has invested a lot of time and effort in making the data more accessible. So you no longer need to register to download data packs, and you no longer need to register to access Table Builder. We have a guest facility where you can get in really quickly, interrogate the data, build your own tables. We've also reviewed and rationalised the community profiles. So there's a general community profile, time series profile, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples profile. And we've also spent a lot of time on the website, which I hope you noticed. It's now, I think it's a very clean census navigation page, very easy to navigate, quicker to get to the information that you want to know, and also quicker to get to the data, and also doesn't have some of the same sort of navigation issues. So it scales automatically for different devices. If you're navigating on your phone, it'll display nicely on that screen. Same with the tablet. Although I wouldn't recommend trying to download data packs on your phone or tablet, our most detailed product. Quick stats. So most of the information that we've talked through tonight, you can actually extract in quick stats. It gives you a really nice detailed summary of 2016 census data at an area level. So we've been talking about the Canberra region. You might be interested in Tuggeranong or Gungahlin. You can find information about a range of different geographic areas very easily using the search widget, and the quick stats tool displays that very accessibly and nicely for you. That's kind of like a good introduction to census data. Community profiles builds on that. So a community profile is an Excel workbook that has a range of predefined tables that get into a lot more detail than quick stats does. You can see a lot of cross classifications about the people, household, family characteristics we've been talking about in the slide pack today. Age by sex, further breakdowns, goes into more detail. The data packs are like a amalgamation of community profiles. So it's sort of like a one-stop shop. You can download a significant amount of data in one hit and then load it into your own systems for further analysis or modelling. We also make geographic boundary information available with that census data so that you can easily map it for further analysis. Statistical geography is a fantastic way to make census data come alive, as we saw with the country of birth information and also the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's information that Duncan showed. Table Builder, so what we've been talking about so far is a range of products the ABS has designed with predefined information, but Table Builder, we kind of put the power in your hands. So give you access to a tool that lets you build tables to your own specifications, cross-classify variables of interest, and extract that information into a CSV or an Excel spreadsheet. The Australian Census longitudinal dataset, so we're really excited for the release of that later this year at the end of 2017. The second issue of the ACLD brings together a 5% sample of 2006, 2011 and 2016 census data, so that third time point is being added this time around, and that will enable some really rich analysis of, population dynamics like flows, transitions. We were talking this morning with a number of our colleagues about changes in people's identification of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander status, or another good example would be, for instance, in Geelong, so the Ford car manufacturing plant's closing down. The people who are employed in the manufacturing industry in Geelong, have they been transitioning into other forms of employment? Have they been moving to other areas of Australia? Have they been undertaking further education or training? The ACLD is really fantastic. So this is the ABS website as it appears now, without the red oval, which is just there to highlight where you can find census information. So abs.gov.au/census. This is our navigation page. So the quick stats search widget in the top left is what I was mentioning before. That's a great way to get access to some data. You can easily toggle between 2016, 2011, 2006, 2001, testing my maths, subtracting 5 years at a time. But a lot of the infographics that we've covered in this slide deck today as well, a lot of that analytical information you can find in the stories from the 2016 census in that left-hand bar. The products you can see in the middle bar, and if you find that any of our data products don't meet your needs and Table Builder doesn't give you the data that you want either, we do have a customised data service where you can ask the ABS to build that for you. That is a charged service, but there's a free quote so that you can understand, like we might say that you can construct that yourself in Table Builder, for example, help you out in that process. And on the right-hand side, we've got a lot of contextual information about the census. So understanding census data and data quality in the top right, that has the Independent Assurance Panel report into the 2016 census. And you can also find the Census Dictionary, our Bible at the ABS. It's a weighty tome, but it's full of very valuable information so that it enables you to really use and interpret census data, understand what we're talking about when we talk about country of birth and some of these other data topics. So I mentioned the analytical products. That's a little bit of what they look like. We've released a number at the end of June, so cultural diversity, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, a snapshot of Australia, sex and gender diversity in the 2016 census. We're planning a number of further releases in the coming months through to October and beyond. So keep an eye out for articles on the ageing population. We're going to produce some summaries about education and work when the second release of census data occurs in October. But yeah, they're a really great resource of getting an insight into what some of these key national stories are on these data topics. That's what a quick stat looks like. So summary information at the top for people, families and dwellings, a map showing you the region that you're talking about, and then beneath that, much more detailed information. Doesn't show up quite as well on the slide, but just underneath Australian Capital Territory, that's a link that, if you want to find out more, you can click that. It will take you straight through to the community profile that you can download. That's what the community profile search return page looks like. But we have a number of data analysts behind this screen who can help you with any questions or accessing census data after the seminar. And this is a bit of a flavour for Table Builder, so we're very happy to run a Table Builder demo for you after the session, show you how to use it, access data, show you some of the features. But what this slide's really highlighting is it's very easy to graph and map data in Table Builder. It's just the click of a button. On the left-hand side, create your table by dragging the variables of interest from our tick box list on the left into your table, hit the play button to get the data, and then at the top you can toggle between data set view, table view, graph view, map view, and you can build your own custom data as well. If you're interested, for example, in the 65 and over population, you can create your own grouping of, the ageing population and then call on that for further analysis. So I mentioned our second release coming up in October. So that's where we're going to get it's going to really enrich the data that's already available, which itself, as we covered, hugely detailed data that's available, but some of the lenses like employment, journey to work, population mobility, education, all that's going to become available in October when we release census data, updating all of our products with that extra information. And as I mentioned, the Australian Census longitudinal dataset from December, as well as some further releases into 2018. So that's the end of our seminar, but we've got time for questions. Very happy to take any questions. And we also, as I mentioned, we have data analysts behind the screen who can help you showcase how to use the website, how to access some of our data products, how to use the data products, and they can also help answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Phil. So any questions? We've got one in the back there, Karuna. We're just getting our mic on. Excellent.
Hi there, thanks for the presentation. So it's really good to get all these free data on terms of demographics. I know ATO also does tax statistics, which they also provide free statistics around tax. I've looked at ABS stats in the past and try to marry up with ATO's tax stat statistics. And I guess there's always discrepancies, particularly around employee and employer sizes and turnover. I'm just wondering if that's something ABS is thinking of trying to align with ATO statistics and stuff like that, or whether it's just really isolated subject matters.
We do a lot of work with the ATO, so the ABS has an outposted officer sort of seconded to the ATO, and so in order to sort of work more closely together, they're one of our largest data providers, so they provide a lot of information to the ABS to save us asking businesses again the same questions that we've already asked. But when it comes to census data, but some of the ATO data that they publish on small area income estimates is really interesting and really valuable data and has the advantage of coming out more regularly than census. But it does actually it misses some parts of a census cover. So people which don't need to put in an income tax return or certain sources of income which might be outside the tax system aren't represented in that data. So I was talking to some of our people from the ANU this morning, researchers, and they were sort of saying, actually, if you're really looking at income, you actually need to look at a number of different sources and need to understand each of those sources and what they can add to your analysis and what value they can add to your analysis in order to be able to bring it together. Your specific comment around the business characteristics, employer size and stuff, I'm sorry, I'm not the best person to answer that. If you want, I can give you a card afterwards and I can get you in touch with some of our business survey experts at the ABS.
Hi, just have probably a question that people who know censuses really well just gonna be like, oh, it's a silly question. But have the census questions remained fairly consistent over time, or if they've changed, how have they changed?
So it depends what time period over time you look at. If you go back to 1911, we've got a pretty different set now. So over time, over a history of a census, we've asked more and more questions and captured more and more detailed information. And they do change to reflect. We used to ask whether or not you had a toilet in your house, and we used to not. We only asked about the internet in more recent times. So those kind of changes. In terms of the last few censuses, though, we've had the same topics in the census since 2006, so the same 45 topics covered by the census. But the actual questions themselves have changed a bit in the last few censuses. So probably the biggest enhancement we had in the censuses census questions in 2016 was we expanded the question on country of birth of parents in order to reflect, I guess, trying to get an even richer picture of our cultural diversity. So last census it asked, was the country of birth of your father born in Australia or overseas, and of your mother in Australia or overseas, whereas this census we actually asked you to specify what country of birth, and so it's allowed us to produce sort of a little bit of a richer picture here. There's been changes to quite a few questions where you move the ordering of responses to the questions based on the popularity from a previous census, so the more common answers are at the top and the least common ones. So certain so Hinduism was in a religion question for the first time as a tick box rather than another, because it had made the sort of list of top 9. The other change to a religion question, which had a bit of coverage, was that we moved no religion as an option from the last, the bottom of the question where it sat under the other box, all the way to the top of the question, reflecting the fact that we thought this census it would become the most popular option. It had sort of slowly increased up, but conceptually it didn't make sense for us to slowly move it up and put it in between the religions. It really needed to sit at the top or the bottom, and so we shifted that to the top, and it would have a contribution to the level of increased no religion reporting in this time, and it's not something we can separate out. It certainly was a strong trend of increase anyway, but at a bigger increase in 2016. Any other questions jump to mind?
So I guess there's quite an extensive consultation process as well on the content for each census. So stay tuned for 2021 coming up, I think later this year or into next year. But it's always like a really interesting one, the balance of like when you change how you ask a question and then how you maintain the time series comparability of that information. The internet is a good example. So just 5 years ago, we kind of asked about dial-up connections and broadband connections, and for the 2016 census, you know, that kind of distinction isn't as relevant as it was 5 years ago, so we just asked, do you access internet from your dwelling or not? And we saw some really interesting results actually through that. A much higher proportion, I think, than we realised still access the internet, like not from home, but maybe from the library or something like that.
So the ACLD, the 5% sample, in my understanding is that in 2006, between 2006 and 2011, it was a statistical matching. Is it the same sort of people that are followed from 2006 to 2016 now? And so the initial 2006 and 2011 was statistically matched, and now it's name matched. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. Not quite. So the matching between 2006 and 2011 of the 5% random cohort was used a statistical probability kind of method. So we used date of birth, area that you lived, marital status, a range of other factors, and by lining them up, you could get about an 80% and success rate in matching the same people together through 5 years. Remembering that the census does ask you where you lived 5 years ago as well as where you live now. So it sort of supported that. What we said that we'd do in 2011 was create a code that was attached to groups of about 1,500 names. So for the people which are in the longitudinal linkage, their names were grouped together with about 1,500 other names together in a group linked code. And we're going to use that method in order to assist the probability linkage over time, because names actually not a perfect linkage over time either, and names do change and people's spelling of them change, the way they record them changes, and so we think through. There's a few papers on this online that talks about the original method being sort of a bronze kind of method, and this method that we're moving to is a silver method. And the silver method should get us closer to about 90%. And so 90%, 80% is pretty great, but the 80% wasn't even across the population either. So some population groups of interest were underrepresented in that set. And so the 90% will give us a better linkage. So what we need to do, so there will be a linkage file which has the same people, their statistical records now linked from 2006 right through to 2016. So you can see sort of a 10-year picture of transitions, as a good example Phil said, like say the manufacturing industry, car manufacturing industry, or different education, and it being undertaken in 2006, and where that's led groups of people to be in 2016. But we're also we'll be producing a 2016 to 2011 linkage, which we top back up to 5%, because over time you do have population die, you do have population emigrate out of Australia, and so we keep topping it up to 5%. Obviously, it's all proved, like every ABS piece of data, we can't release it in a way that allows you to identify anyone in the data, otherwise I go to jail, and I'm not that keen on that as an option.
So can I just ask, you said there were 1,500, like that group of 1,500. If it's 5% of the Australian population, what's that relationship between those 1,500 people and the 5%?
So it's 1,500 names. So it's a name grouping algorithm. So rather than having it in 2011 each name linked to a unique kind of ID or number, so over the John Smiths and the Jeff Smiths might be put together with the same code as the Ken Smiths and the so it's a bunch of names grouped together, so that you go, actually, if these two have got the same name code and they've also got the same date of birth and they're also living in the same area, we're pretty confident that this is a matching record without actually needing to have those names anymore attached to the data. Or so if you saw that record by itself, then it's unlikely to be identified.
I just had, thank you for the presentation. I just had a quick question regarding the table builder that's available to the public. I wanted to check whether or not that is just census data going into the table builder, or does it include other sources of data as well?
So we have census table builder and we have survey table builder. So it's the same basic system. We can show you census table builder, which has census data sets in it. Survey table builder is a charge product, and you can purchase a subscription. So we use a subscription pricing model where you can get access to some of our social survey information. So you might get education data sets, as well as a number of our income data sets together, and that'll give you the ability to undertake some really sophisticated analysis based on some of our survey outputs. So there are the two different systems and a wealth of data available to you, but Census Table Builder has a significant free component, the basic version of Table Builder, where all you need to do is register an email address and then you can save tables. You get quite a lot of detailed information in Table Builder Basic, so yeah.
Run down the front here.
Thanks for the information. This is a very general question, but I'm just wondering about the integrity of your data collections and honesty and trust. Do you get any impression, that we are a very honest sort of population, and to the last man and woman we strive to do our returns, to the utmost accuracy? And are there risk management sort of mechanisms to sort of account for maybe the recalcitrance in tiny number in our communities?
Yeah,
No doubt.
Good questions. You spend a lot of time analysing the data to try and make sure that we understand its quality, and so that we can communicate about that quality in the statements that we put out with the data. Some of the things that we do is that we check the data for consistency over time. We also check the data for consistency with other data sources. So if we're looking at our migrant population, we can look at the number of people which have arrived from overseas, number of people who have left from overseas. If we look at income, we do surveys, detailed surveys with interviewers, and we look for the distribution of those incomes and the comparability. And what we've seen broadly across all of the different areas is that the census data is very robust, and nearly every Australian will try and fill it out to the best of their ability. What I'd What you do see in the data is, like, occasionally you will see someone is 625 years old, and so we have a number of sort of checks to try and pick up on that, but it's not statistically significant in the data. One of the exercises I mentioned earlier, the post-enumeration survey, where we're actually interviewing people, that helps us get another set of data to bring together the census data. And to me, it's not generally about people not trying to do the right thing. We just miss some people in the census. So we've got this strange phenomenon in international censuses that people forget their babies. So there's always an undercount of 0-year-olds in the census. People forget that they had a baby in the last year. I don't know how you do that. Also, like 20 to 29-year-olds are harder for us to count in the census. And some of that might be compliance, but a lot of that is actually, no one actually knows where a 20 to 29-year-old lives these days. When they do their washing at home, and they do seem to live at their girlfriend's house, and they're actually just harder to reach. They're likely to be working, studying, so it's harder for us to make contact. And so that survey afterwards allows us to make adjustments for parts of the population that we know that we've missed or included. But all the analysis that we've done on this census suggests that there's no new sort of issues or concerns. We haven't released the number of Jedis yet, but we'll get that number out at some stage. But when you think about that as a proportion, I think last census was 65,000, and to a question which is optional in the census, like we're not concerned that people aren't trying to do the right thing and trying to provide us with good data. All right, we might wrap up general questions there, but Phil and I will be around for a while. We'll lift this screen up, and we've got some great data analysts behind here. So if anyone does want to see how to do something on the website or want to find out a number they don't know, then please try the team out. I'd love to help you. But thank you so much for coming along and sparing some time this evening.
I'm in the media team.
Hey, how you going?
Do you guys
Yeah.
just out of curiosity.